The mic on you, Dr. Steve.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Barnett, founding co-director of the National Institute for Early Education Research and distinguished professor at Rutgers University. I'll moderate today's panel, which is sponsored by the Khalifa International Award for Early Learning. The Khalifa International Award for Early Learning exemplifies the keenness of the late Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, President of the United Arab Emirates, to encourage research and innovation in early learning and to promote best practice in early childhood education. Initiated by His Highness Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Vice President and Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, the award makes awards 4 prizes annually, 2 for best research and 2 best program or practice. For those who may be interested in applying, the web link will be put into the chat. Today, we bring you a wonderful opportunity to hear from 3 experts in early care and education focused on improving early childhood education in low and moderate income countries. Their presentations will be followed by a brief question and answer session. At that time, please put your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. I'm delighted to introduce the speakers we have with us today, beginning with Professor Nirmala Rao, Serena H.C. Yang Professor in Early Childhood Development and Education at Hong Kong University, and a member of the awarding committee for the Khalifa International Award in Early Learning. She will speak on enhancing equitable access to quality early childhood education, noteworthy policy and practice. Following Nirmala, you will hear from Candice Potgieter, Chief Executive Officer of the Unlimited Child and a winner of the award, and she'll speak on the role of social entrepreneurship in shaping the future of early learning in low and moderate income countries. Finally, Dr. Milagros Norez, co-director for research at the National Institute for Early Education Research, will speak on key considerations for ECE financing. And with no further introduction, over to you, Nirmala.
Thank you, Steve. So just give me a moment to share my screen. I'm not able to share just now, just a moment. Please, can you tell me if you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction. I'm very delighted to be able to spend some time talking about enhancing equitable access to quality early childhood education. My focus will be on low and middle income countries, but I will talk about some noteworthy policy and practices in the developed world as well. For my presentation, I will have 5 parts. I would like to highlight the global commitment to early childhood education and variations in access to early childhood services. Then I will speak on the movement from access to access plus quality. We want children to all benefit from high quality services. I will then turn to the key features of high performing systems and provide some recommendations for establishing high quality systems in low and middle income countries. So let me begin with the commitment that our global community has made to early childhood education. The right to education is enshrined in the most widely ratified treaty in the world, and that is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this was put forward in 1989. In 1990, there was a world conference in Jomtien, Thailand, and at that time, member states adopted the World Declaration on Education for All. And for the first time, we heard a very important phrase that has been used in our field, and that is learning begins at birth. Uh, Following the Jomtien conference, a decade later, the Dakar Framework of Action was ratified at the World Education Forum in Senegal, and signatories committed to expanding and improving comprehensive early childhood care and education, especially for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged children. That is the key, the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. Another 10 years later, UNESCO held the World Conference on Early Childhood Care and Education in Moscow. And at that time, participants endorsed the Moscow Framework of Action. And the concern there was the lack of investment in early childhood education. And after that, we had the Education 2030 agenda, or the sustainable, or known as the Sustainable Development Goals. And at that time, we had it was held in Incheon, Korea, and we called it the Incheon Framework of Action. And we, for the first time, there was a goal specifically, a target specifically directed at early childhood, and I'll talk about that some more. More recently, we had the World Conference on Early Childhood Care and Education hosted by UNESCO in Tashkent, uh, Uzbekistan. And the Tashkent Declaration highlighted five main actions that need to be taken. This includes inclusive and equitable early childhood care and education, a focus on the early childhood care and education workforce, innovation for transformation, diversifying early childhood learning spaces, practices, and provisions, and lastly, an emphasis on policy, governance, and financing. So I would like to just take a minute to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly Target 4, which is concerned with education and ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. There are two targets specifically related to early childhood education that states members have to report on. There are a few other targets, but they have to report on these two. And one is two indicators. One is target indicator 4.2.1, which is the proportion of children 24 to 59 months who are developmentally on track in the areas of health, learning, and psychosocial well-being. And the other one is participation rate in organized learning 1 year before primary school. So please note, this is only 1 year of pre-primary education before starting grade one or standard one or primary one, elementary grade one, right? So, however, the progress towards SDG target indicators has been less than optimal. There has been a gap between intention and execution. So you can see that we are committed in terms of the treaties that we've ratified, the conventions that we subscribe to providing quality early childhood care to our youngest children. However, we do see global variations in access to early childhood education. Um, this graph shows you differences between low income, middle income, and high income countries. So if you see the yellow line on the top, in high income countries, over 90% of children attend at least 1 year of pre-primary education before they start grade one. Right. However, you can see after 2020, there's a decline in all countries, and that's the COVID-19 effect, right? All countries show decreased progress. You can see in low income countries, the rate is below 50% now, right? It was about 30%, it's increasing, and middle income countries are in between. So basically, we see lots of disparity based on income of the country. The same data I provide here, and it's divided by SDG regions. Now, again, this is just 1 year of pre-primary education before grade one. Now, as you know, in some countries, grade one starts at age 5. In some countries, it starts at age 7. So they're just looking at 1 year before standard one. Again, you see the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa have the lowest enrollment rate, around 40%, but the green line right on top shows Northern America and Europe, the developed world, which has higher enrollment country rates, and in between you have the other regions. The East and Southern Asia region, the orange line is doing well, but in what we know is Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, that's the blue line, tend to have the lowest enrollment rates. So we are really concerned about um, social justice, about equality, about equity. And I think this diagram really nicely illustrates the point that I'd like to make. So what we want is all children to access high quality early childhood services, hence the title of my talk, Equitable Access to High Quality. But the reality is, in many countries, rich children or children from wealthy families get high quality services, whereas children from lower income families or children poverty from poverty backgrounds get lower quality services. So what governments do is they try to provide a level playing field. In some contexts, they provide free education for all, which is illustrated by the second diagram on from your left, which is equality. But still, the disadvantaged don't benefit. So then governments move to an equity focus, giving children what they need. So this is the idea behind programs that provide compensatory education, such as Sure Start, Head Start, ICDS. So all children can benefit based on or get the services they need. More recently, we've moved towards a social justice orientation, um, where we want to remove systemic barriers for all children, so everyone can get uh, can get the services that they deserve, that they for their optimal development. And more recently, we've moved to the idea of inclusion, where everyone is valued and involved. So when I talk about equity and access, I really need to mention non-state actors. And the term non-state actors refers to organizations that provide education, that finance education. They can be private or faith-based providers. Uh, they provide a large proportion of pre-primary education places in many regions of the world, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. Uh, it's estimated that in high income countries, um, non-state actors, that is non-government providers, uh, provide 57% of the places for children under 3. It's particularly prevalent for the children under 3. Now, having non-state actors is not an issue if the services are regulated, right? So in the context, in some countries, it's like over 90%, but the government regulates the quality of the services by having standards for teachers, having standards for teacher-child ratios, having standards for operation of programs. However, there is a controversy about non-state actors because a lot of people feel education is a public good and it's the state's obligation to provide pre-primary education to children. People are concerned that non-state provision meets the needs of wealthy and urban families. However, what has happened is in many low and middle income countries, we have private schools for the poor in low and middle income countries, and they're not regulated, right? We also have gender issues when you have non-state provision in places like India, where they have a very strong son preference. Parents send the girls to the cheap or free government school, and the boys get to the private school with better teachers. Um, in Malawi, it's the other way around. Girls are getting the preferred programs, right? The big problem with non-state actors is we just don't know about how many children attend these programs because there are data gaps, right? And there's not enough on monitoring. So we have a lot of other concerns about quality. One is the lack of progress that we've made. The World Bank found that 53% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries could not read or understand a short text. We're concerned that there has been an increase in access to primary education, pre-primary education without quality. So our concern is to enhance equitable access to quality ECE. So as a community, we have moved from just providing services to making sure these services are of a high quality. I want to talk a little bit about the 5 pillars of high performing systems from a book by Lynn Kagan. She said there are 5 important things. Okay, she did a study of high performing systems in the developed world. And she said these high performing systems have something in common. They have strong policy uh, foundation, they have comprehensive services, they support teachers and parents, they have a good pedagogical foundation, and they use data to drive improvement. So what I'd like to do is give you some examples of these countries or just examples from low and middle or high income countries in my region. Okay, so UNESCO promotes the 5A framework to ECE, and basically we need to make sure that services are available, accessible, acceptable, adaptable, and there's accountability, right? So we need to have the strong policy and legal foundation. Now, this diagram shows you that we have about 193 or not 194 more recently countries in the world. And um, of these countries, we don't have data from all countries, but what we find is that only 51 countries provide 1 year of pre-primary education that's compulsory. Okay. Some countries make it free, but only 46 countries make pre-primary education free and compulsory. And it's very important. Let me give you an example of Brazil, which in 2009 made education for 4-year-olds compulsory. So what happened is we see a decrease in wealth gaps. So this is called an equiplot, this diagram. And right on the top, you have 2010, before the policy was implemented. And in 2019, the policy was implemented, right? And the yellow dot is the most advantaged, the richest quintile, and the black dot is the poorest quintile of families sending their children to preschool 1 year before primary school. And what we see is when the policy changes, these wealth gaps disappear. They almost disappear. Then we see the COVID effect. So when governments make pre-primary education free and compulsory, um, what happens is wealth gaps in access decrease. Um, I'm going a little fast because I'm aware of the time. The second example comes from where I live in Hong Kong, where the government invested heavily in pre-primary education. In 2007, right at the beginning, they implemented a voucher scheme where parents were given a voucher, and that voucher can be encashed in preschools. However, the government was very smart because they linked the voucher encashment to quality benchmarks set by them. In 2017, they moved to from demand side funding to supply side funding. So now they gave the money to the kindergartens and the pre-primary centers, and they had to make sure they met the government benchmark. So you can see the funding increased absolutely dramatically. So basically, it's really Hong Kong has a free market system. It's all in the private sector. They're all non-state providers, but they're very strongly regulated, so the quality is good. The other aspect of a high quality system is having a good workforce. We know that there's a real shortage of early childhood education. The World Bank report estimated 43 million shortage of childcare workers from assuming a quota or a ratio of 1 to 5 for children under 3 and 1 to 15 for children from 3 to 6. And there's a real shortage. The UNESCO suggests there's a shortage of 6 million children to meet the SDG goal of 1 year of pre-primary education. So what really needs to happen is we need to attract the best teachers into the profession, prepare them well, retain them, and support them with continuous professional development. Singapore provides an example of informed, individualized, and continuous pedagogy. They keep updating their uh, curriculum framework to deal with changes in society and in the world. So now you hear everyone talking about AI, digital citizenship. So we really need to keep updating our services. And the very good things about Singapore's curriculum framework are the alignment between curriculum and learning outcomes. We talk about learning objectives all the time. The alignment between pedagogical approaches and assessment practices, guides for teachers, a good oversight of curriculum implementation, and addressing the transition to primary school. We also see examples of good pedagogy or responsive pedagogy in other parts of the world. In India, they have gender responsive pedagogy. We know, like people talk about girls and STEM, not getting girls enough in certain disciplines. We're moving towards gender responsive teaching, having material, space, and activities that will get uh, girls engaged in education and engaging with parents, caregivers, and community. Very important is to have data to drive improvement. And I'm going to give you two examples, one from UNICEF's Early Child Development Index, where they have nationally representative data based on parent report on child outcomes. And actually, our data say from the countries that we have it that 30% of children are not on track to meet the development goals. So it's really important to have reliable and actionable data to know where children are. And these are used, this particular instrument is used to track progress towards SDG 4.2 indicator. The Australian Early Childhood Development Census is an amazing initiative by the Australian government. Every 5 years, every single child in the country has a teacher report to see if they're on track in the major areas of physical and mental well-being, social competence, language, and communication skills. And this is used to drive decide on policy. We have something that we call hotspots, where very many children are not on track and government provides extra resources. So, just with those few examples, what are the lessons that we've learned? What are some of the things to establish a high quality system in low and middle income countries? So first, we need to improve the capacity of the workforce. As I said, there's 6 million teachers short, according to UNESCO, to have 1 year of pre-primary education. We should have a curriculum and age appropriate pedagogy. We need to create a safe and stimulating environment, and we need to expand access while continuing to focus on quantity. This is the latest book, 20, just come out a few months ago, about the strong foundation. And thank you very much. And I apologize if I went a little bit over time, Dr. Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmala. And now we'll go to Candace.
Thanks, Steve. I'm just going to share my screen as well. So everyone, today, thank you so much for having me on this webinar. I'm actually going to try something different. I'm actually going to use the aid of storytelling to showcase how social entrepreneurship is working in low and middle income countries to scale early learning, and a simple recipe or blueprint that is tried and tested to have proven results as such. Now, a name that most of us will know is actually Florence Nightingale. You know, Florence Nightingale lived in the United Kingdom during a very important time. She's also widely known as the founder of modern nursing, or best known for also revolutionizing healthcare. Now, a name that most of us will probably not know is Letiwe Mkhize. Now, let me tell you a little bit of Letiwe. So she's also from a kingdom, the Kingdom of KwaZulu-Natal, a small part of a province in South Africa. She's also known to be living during a very momentous or important time. And she's not widely known as yet, but she's known in her community as improving the lives of children and their access to early quality learning. Now, two women in vastly different geographies, two vastly different times, and maybe some would even say two vastly different sectors, one in nursing and one in early learning. But not so fast. They are two women in the same profession, leaders in social enterprise in low or middle income areas. Now, being asked to deliver a presentation on social entrepreneurship today in shaping the future of early learning in low and middle income settings, this story and the similarities came to my mind. So we're going to examine it. Now, Florence Nightingale can be viewed as a social entrepreneur because she combined innovation, a drive for social impact, and a sustainable approach to reforming healthcare. And here's how she exemplified this and how this approach can be used in early learning, with an example of our very own Florence, as I described a little bit earlier, Letiwe Mkhize. Now, first of all, Nightingale identified a social problem. She recognized a critical social issue, the poor condition and high mortality rates in hospitals. At the time, hospitals were often dirty, they lacked proper sanitation, and had untrained staff. Now, Nightingale was determined to reform healthcare practices and address these issues. So today, Letiwe is a shining example in her community. Back in 2015, she started as a child minder on her own without any government or community influence. She just recognized that there were children that had no place to go when their mothers wanted to find work. And adding to this, she was a family member of a local headmaster. So she also realized that children were going to school not ready for school. So she was ready to do something about it, and she wanted to reform early education in her community. Now let's go back to Florence. So as a pioneer in the healthcare field, Florence Nightingale introduced new practices such as improving sanitation and patient care, which drastically obviously reduced infection and death rates. Now, these innovations were based on her use of data, as she meticulously gathered and analyzed statistics. She applied evidence-based practices to healthcare reform. This data-driven approach was revolutionary for the time that she lived in, and it laid the groundwork for modern nursing today. Now, today, Letiwe can be seen as a pioneer in her community. She owns what we call in South Africa and most of Africa, the largest financially sustainable ECD center. She employs 6 other ECD practitioners. She services over 200 children on a property that is now fit for purpose. Letiwe is also part of a network of over 5,200 ECD centers that belong to the Unlimited Child, having serviced over 2 million children across 5 countries. So let us ask ourselves the question, does Letiwe collect data? Does she analyze this data? Does she apply evidence-based practices? Well, fortunately for us, we've come a long way since 1856. Over 168 years later, we now have the power of partnership. By belonging to a larger network of social franchisees or ECD centers that has an ultimate social franchisor, the Unlimited Child, and their not-for-profit partner, data can now be collected, analyzed, and put back into the system to be tried and tested by the likes of Letiwe, so that the solution provided from an early learning landscape is fit for purpose and standardized. Along with governmental frameworks, these evidence-based frameworks can lead to the duplication and scaling as a social innovation. Now, what about sustainability and institutional change? Well, Florence Nightingale's work didn't stop at providing temporary relief. She institutionalized her reforms by founding the Nightingale's Training School for Nurses, which helped professionalize nursing and established it as a respected and skilled profession. Her approach was systemic. Rather than treating individual patients, she sought to overhaul the entire system of healthcare delivery. So this innovative solution of a social franchisee, where the ECD centers, such as the one Letiwe owns, becomes part of a network, means that the ECD sector or early learning sector can be professionalized. All ECD centers or early learning centers and practitioners receive standardized training that includes coaching and mentoring. In this systemic approach, this sector can be seen as an employment and career pathway for young women and even some men. Now, Nightingale's influence extended far beyond the battlefield. By professionalizing nursing and advocating for reforms, she ensured that the changes she initiated were scalable, enabling others to replicate and sustain her innovations. So, did Letiwe replicate herself? Well, the answer is a simple yes. Was she able to sustain her early learning center? The answer, again, a simple yes. Last year, her income as a micro enterprise afforded her the possibility of growing this micro enterprise to service more children, renovating her own home as well as the ECD center, and sending her very own children to university. So we can see, as a woman in the community, she also became financially viable as well. But most importantly, across Africa and in the Middle East, in a humanitarian aid context, there are over 10,000 Letiwes who have been replicated through the same franchisee network of the Unlimited Child, using an early learning blueprint that informs school readiness and works hand in hand with government frameworks. Now, most importantly, if we go back to Florence Nightingale, she was also a strong advocate for healthcare reform at a policy level. She worked closely with government officials to influence policy, which further amplified her social impact. Now, today, as social enterprises informing social impact, we need to feed the system in showcasing solutions and ensuring that our partnerships between government and civil society, as well as social investment partners, is strong, so the solutions can be amplified. Now, as this topic is in the early learning field, and we know what is a story without illustrations, let's have a real look at Letiwe and the real life Letiwes of our communities. So this is in South Africa, duplicated in Zimbabwe, duplicated in Malawi, in Yemen, in the Middle East, in Ethiopia. Now, let's go back. And this is also using the Unlimited Child system, so it could be replicated everywhere as a social enterprise. Now, back to Florence. Florence Nightingale's combination of social vision, innovation, systemic reform, and a sustainable model for change aligns closely with the principles of social entrepreneurship. So her recipe was simple, and ours can also be that simple. Now, these principles include a trained and skilled workforce in early learning, using data to inform iterative and contextual solutions, so data in and data out, maximizing the use of existing resources and infrastructure. So what we need to look at, are there social enterprises such as Letiwe who are childminders that we can unlock their real potential to actually inform the system? And most importantly, the power of partnership. So how do we work within government, civil society, and make sure that we also have investors into the social enterprise to have a greater reach? Now, in 30 years' time, when we hear the name Letiwe Mkhize, and perhaps names such as the Unlimited Child, we will remember how following this simple recipe for social entrepreneurship shaped early learning. In 2054, Letiwe Mkhize will probably be 76 years old. Will she be remembered by name? I'm not so sure, but she will certainly be remembered by the legacy of her social enterprise shifting the lives of children in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Candace. And now we go to Milagros.
Thank you. Thank you both. That was wonderful. Let me just quickly set this up, my computer. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk about key considerations in ECD financing and thinking really about systems around supporting every child, but with a funding perspective aligned to it. So beyond the rights of children and the humanity of each child that inspires this conversation today, as Mala mentioned, we now have SDG target 4.3 as a minimal guide in goal in the field. So like a North Star of where to go, but still as a minimal component of what we want in the early childhood field. And she also gave us a look at access. With this in mind, colleagues in the early childhood field have estimated the cost of inaction. So I wanted to start us off with looking at this as to center our thoughts around early childhood and investing in early childhood. It gives us a look about the cost in foregone lifetime earnings, just looking at what children that do not have 1 year of pre-primary lose in terms of foregone earnings, and adding that at a country level, and what is the consequence of that in terms of as a percentage of the GDP. And this is what this graphic looks at for 134 countries. So thinking about parameters of what a good quality center-based program would look like, the authors find considerable losses to countries comparable to or even greater than what governments spend in all educational levels as a percentage of the GDP. And this is particularly the case in lower and middle income countries, with some of them losing over 77% of the GDP annually, which is showed in the darker part of in some of the darker blues in the graphic. So to the development of strong and aligned and well-funded systems in early childhood start with building with an understanding of what are the basic tenets of why are we doing it, and so why early childhood programs matter, and they matter for children's lifelong development success, but also why does it matter that they are good quality programs, because that is very aligned to the funding components of this. So we know that these are the years of rapid development where children are highly responsive to interventions that can ameliorate external risks, which the nurture care framework in early childhood talks a lot about the different risks that have to do, environment, including in them for children. So this gives us a possibility of reducing some of those through and reducing the opportunity gap to access to early childhood. But quality is central to achieving many of the long-term outcomes that we want. And in here, dosage, the qualifications, the class sizes, the ratios, if we're talking about pre-primary, the qualifications of the home visiting programs, of the parenting individuals, and the content, the curriculum that is developed, all of those are things of quality that matter for long-term outcomes. But also, and more so in the developing world, both health and education are integral components of child's development. So if we all want to understand children and we understand their development holistically, then the systems that are aligned with children's development also have to be looked at that way. So that's why we talk that capacity systems in early childhood and early child development is really an intersectoral problem, that we need many sectors to work because there are many aspects of children's development that matters. Different case studies of countries and programs provide some guidance on what makes programs in our countries effective in implementing and scale up. And Imran did talk about some of these. Legal mandates and strong political leadership can go a long way towards strengthening and allocation of resources in early childhood. And this has been done through comprehensive intersectoral strategies in Chile, Colombia, Jamaica, India, Peru, and through compulsory pre-primary mandates in countries like Argentina or Brazil. But also where there is a trend on developing to subnational governments, so that has happened in many countries, we also want to make sure that the funding follows that system, so that if we're gonna devolve to subnational governments, that the funding also goes all the way down to the lower governments that we want. So ultimately, all of this works. Any early childhood program only works if programs are really sufficiently funded, so that we are able to attain what we want in terms of children's development. So one key component for systems building then is vertical integration, which includes aligned vertical funding. It's not just whether the pieces are there, but also are we bringing the funding so that it reaches the levels that we want in terms of programming. This has to do with investing in national to local capacity. If the implementation is local, that is very significant and important. It includes the participation of all the different levels of development, all the levels of government in the development of a strategy. You want to ensure buy-in, you want to ensure scalability, you want to ensure implementation. So this is important across the board. Coordination with services that are strong subnationally and locally. This could be nutritional programs, home visiting, health visits, healthcare, basic programming, and or whatever other programs are strong locally. And defining roles and responsibilities across levels and programs. This has a lot to do with avoiding that two sectors and ministries are misaligned or are competing for the same funding. Establish interinstitutional agreements, mostly if there's some agreement and that matters for implementation as well, and to ensure the holistic and the comprehensive and intersectoral work that matters for children. Sometimes partnership with donors can be used to strengthen alignment. This is also true for social entrepreneurship, actually. It is important that besides everything that we know about data and alignment in the data part, that we also have communication plans around this. What are we all trying to do, and what does it matter? And this helps for the sustainability of a program over time. But another central component of building systems is horizontal alignment. And many of the same actions that define strong vertical alignment also define strong horizontal alignment. And funding is also the key aspect here. So you want to invest in capacity across sectors. Think of this as a puzzle where all the sectors are coming together around the child: health, education, social protection, agriculture. But many times when we talk about intersectoral alignment, we don't talk about the Ministry of Finance, which is actually the one that provides the funding for every one of those aspects. So this is critical that they're also part of the conversation. They are all potentially equally valuable pieces in this puzzle, right? So aligning sectors under an EC national or a subnational strategy and resources is critical. Many times the programs are designed, thought very carefully, but ultimately when the moment comes to ask to the Ministry of Finance or the equivalent unit in a country, the efforts fail, right? So this is, for example, the case in Argentina and in the last few decades, when you have this intention around strengthening the early childhood sectors, but sometimes when the ask comes, there are other aspects that are more critical for development, and early childhood ends up being at the bottom of the pool of priorities. This highlights how important it is to coordinate all programs and policies around such early childhood strategies, and also think of early childhood education and the basic education systems as a continuum and multi-sectorally. Many of the stages of development where the cutoffs are sometimes divisions at under 3, above 6, or in elementary, they're really all artificial. And some of the aspects that we keep on trying to fill in the holes that we've created by starting a basic education at some level and not at a lower level. But some countries have, what they've done is they've moved the boundary down, like Argentina and Brazil, in which they bring other levels back into the education system, rather than trying to build patches under the basic education system. We also want to build on the strengths of different sectors and leverage programs that have reached hard-to-reach populations. Here, I think it's important that we ask who reaches most children in this region, in this area, whether it's the Ministry of Agriculture, it might be the Ministry of Health, that reaches families in rural areas best. And we want to leverage this to make sense programmatically, but it also makes sense financially. And align indicators that can be used across levels of governments and sectors to make sure that the intersectoral efforts are strengthened. So data here is central. And commitment with aligned funding and subsequent co-responsibility. So different sectors have both pieces: the alignment, the funding, and what they're responsible of. In addition, there are a few. I'm going to give an overview of 4 funding principles that are central to effective policy at large. But they're very because this early childhood system is being grown in many places and built, it is particularly important to think around early childhood. So adequacy really means programs are funded to serve all children and families who want and need the services, and they do so with enough program quality for strong positive outcomes to be realized. So we fund them well. So we might define, and we might decide that only some groups of populations are going to have access to it. But if we define some eligibility restrictions, we then have to make sure that we fund the program so that every child under that benchmark of eligibility is able to attend the program, rather than piecemeal and then only serve 30% of those eligible. Sustainability is central, funding that is stable over the long term, and that may or can grow as programs scale up, particularly when we're building the system. Sometimes with many, as Imala said, many countries don't even have pre-primary education universally. So this requires long-term revenue streams and possibly diversified streams. Most education systems have managed this for basic education and primary education, but we seem to struggle when it comes to adding a few more years. And that's a good question of why. Why are we struggling? What is the best way to do this for our country? In addition, we're using funding mechanisms because we're patching. We're many times using funding mechanisms that fluctuate significantly, and then that was gonna limit our growing over the years and our sustainability over the years. 2 other central principles in funding is equity, alignment to the needs of families and children with a focus on reducing the early opportunity gaps. It is not equally costly to serve children with typical development from children with special needs or rural children or versus peri-urban children. The truth is the cost is different, and funding with an equity embedded in it has to take that into account. And phased in is the concept of targeted universal approaches, in which we're thinking, if we're growing, where do we start? Are we going to be very targeted at the beginning and then moving towards access that is universal? And so if that's the case, we might consider addressing the most critical gaps in early opportunities early on, and then prioritizing marginalized communities or rural communities or specific communities that have very little access, and making sure that their funding can also grow as we grow the programs to scale them, with a focus on sustaining quality throughout the growth life of a program. So some revenue strategies, I'm going to go through these, and then I'll give you examples about this. But governments at all levels have explored different ways of funding early childhood across the world. Many do so as the national revenue aligned with early childhood with basic education funding formulas. This is the most stable, and it just aligns it with the rest of the basic education, primary education, etc. But then most of the innovation has been done in what is called earmark sources, or finding a source where all the funding from that source goes directly to early childhood. Since this our funding this would make it typically outside of basic primary education, and it's just a little funding pool or a big funding pool that serves just for this for this goal. And it does require strong legal policy and implementation frameworks are aligned for this funding to make sure that it's, not every change of government is going to change the funding source or what it is earmarked for, particularly if you want sustainability over time. Innovative financing could be central to the principles that we have talked about, adequacy and sustainability and ensuring long-term growth. But realistically, it is also important that it is easy to administer. If it's a combination of many resources that we have to bring them together and then distribute that also creates complications around growing in the early childhood field. But there are also smaller innovations, funding innovations that can be important, particularly as catalytics to specific early childhood initiatives, or to strengthen system capacity, or to support quality improvements, or support data. So all of these are different ways. So the first three on here, the national aligned with basic education, the most stable. National revenue earmarked for early childhood is generally pretty stable. So you have some source, but it's national source or regional source that goes directly and it's earmarked for early childhood. And then there is also local tax revenue or national transfer from local. All of those might be the way that we fund basic education, and we also grow it for early childhood. All of those are pretty stable. But then there are also specialized or SIN taxes. Both of those are very specific taxes that we only either increase a little bit or levy for the specific purpose of early childhood. And some of those are alcohol, soda, tobacco, etc., are typically passed on to consumers. But they are, it does depend on consumer trends. So that gives a little bit of problems on the sustainability over time. And they're considered pretty aggressive because they, depending on the goods, because they represent a greater percentage of the household budget on lower income families. Then there's sales tax, which you're just increasing. Here, you might just increase the percentage of a sales tax and earmark that for early childhood. That's a way also of using this innovative way and putting it into early childhood. There is local tax increases. Sometimes voters approved an increase in whatever is the local tax, just with the earmarking for early childhood. And then there's a lot of blending sometimes of sources, combining multiple revenues. This here for blending vertical and horizontal alignment is very, very, very critical because otherwise sustainability, it's a risk. Some countries include tuitions where fees are charged, or some percentage of the fees are charged to families who are not eligible for free programs based on whatever the eligibility restrictions we've made. And then marginal tax rates, expansions. There's sometimes something innovative in the United States is what is called pay in lieu of taxes pilot, in which say you provide companies an incentive to come and be in this region, in this city, and then that is usually through tax breaks. But then once those expire, you take the money that comes from those tax breaks directly earmarked into early childhood. And then there's growing emergent evidence on social impact bonds. So here are some examples. Aligned with basic education, you have countries like Brazil and Argentina, in which is just whatever the same revenue, the same mechanism that funds basic education, funds early childhood, the 374s that are included. Payroll tax. Colombia has funded early childhood programs through a 2 to 3% national payroll tax since 1974. Gaming tax, Jamaican, these are the SIN taxes. Jamaica and the Philippines use gaming taxes to fund early childhood education. Lottery funding in the United Kingdom and in the United States. Some states in the United States have earmarked funds for early childhood education that come from lotteries. Tobacco tax, this is being used, for example, in the state of California in the United States. Beverage tax, some cities, this is a lot of, it's coming up with cities in different places, beverage tax, other SIN taxes. And the same, there's sale tax, and these are all at the city level provided. Social impact bonds, special bonds that have been issued to finance early childhood programs in South Africa, and for example, in case of the U.S., the state of Utah. And then there is something pretty new that I'm just learning about and trying to learn more about, which is the Debt2Ed, which is an initiative from the Global Partnership for Education, in which you transform debt service payments from countries into, they goes to fund the SDG 4, including early childhood, which is a 4.3. So instead of the country just paying its debt and that going back to some revenue or whatever the donor agency is, some of that payment goes straight into education and reinvested in the country's education system. There have been some efforts to establish some benchmarks on country. How much should we be funding? How much should early childhood should be investing at a minimum? Research studies suggest a minimum domestic benchmark of about 1% of the GDP is as a minimum requirement to assure provision of quality early childhood services, and an aspirational goal about 2%. Current expenditure for ages 3 to 6, for example, in OECD countries, is about half of that. So it's 0.5, because you're thinking that's half of the group between 0 and 6. But in the rest of the world, it's highest in Central and Eastern Europe, followed by Latin America, the Caribbean, and with the lowest investment levels in Sub-Saharan Africa. And as a comprehensive, what is called the Nurture and Care Package, which has aligned all the aspects around the services, but nutrition as well, and so forth. It would cost about 2 to 7%. 2.7. It's 2.7 for in some countries, and 1.2% for the lower middle countries, and 0.8. So you could have serve every children in this age group with less than 3% of the GDP. And the pre-primary group would be about half of that, but about 1% or 1.5%. This is current government expenditure. As you see, most of it, of the country of the world, and the low-income countries are in the under 0.5% of a GDP for the whole pre-primary. So what we want is to bring that up ideally. That's kind of a benchmark. And then to finish, I wanted to give a sense of when we think about funding, we think about the source, but what are we funding? We have to think about the costing principles behind it. Most of us think about how to bring funding and align it with what the programs cost for them to be high quality. Think about the ingredients method, which is asking what resources or what ingredients are needed to provide the high quality early childhood services that we want. And this includes the initial investment, startup costs such as infrastructure, operational costs such as personnel, material, supply. This is the everyday aspects that we need, being personnel, the teachers, the home visitors, all, depending on what program we're building, the most important key components. And imputed costs, which are voluntary, what happens otherwise with the money, and so forth. For this, it's very important to have the frequency and duration as key components. Are we talking about half-day programs, full-day programs? What is the cost of each ingredient? Even when they are subsidized, we need to understand it, because we are not sure that subsidies are sustainable, and we need to be able to fund that program adequately. And then we add all of this to overall cost and a per child cost to really understand what is the program that we need and how much does it cost, and then align funding to that aspects, rather than decide on the funding first and then figure out what we can do in terms of programming. And then also understand whether there are ECD services that has added components. Do we have nutrition? Do we need health checkups? And look at the synergies between the programs and the different intersectoral alignment that has to go with this. There is definitely some costing tools out there. This is an example of them. Many of them, the earlier ones, offer a range of important contributions, but we really are. This is a section that is growing and growing very fast in early childhood, because it's at the core of funding them well and ensuring long-term outcomes for children. So, for example, the first one, the ones from Brookings, is really a response to a demand of really knowing how much it's going to cost, and understand what do we need to, and how do we how we collect the data, and how do we make it effective, and how do we understand it, and also to make it pretty flexible so that we can use tools that we can look at costs for center-based program, and we're thinking about children in centers or home visiting programs or parenting programs, whichever is the aspect that we have able to effectively cost it. So these are some of the ones that we have in the field currently. They're leading. There's a UNICEF tool, one that also has been tested in several countries with case studies. There's a little bit older one comes from JPAL Policy Center studies. There is this Dioptra new one which helps programs at humanitarian development agencies estimate the cost efficiency of their programs and compare to benchmarks. So a few tools out there for us to guide our expense, our costing part to then align funding with. Ultimately, these are the conclusions around, or what I'm trying to bring together today in terms of key considerations is ECD investments are critical for development. We know that, but quality is one of the central aspects around it. And quality is really dependent on funding runs. If we don't fund programs well, we will get what we're paying for. So legal mandates and strong leadership help with aligning funding resources. If it's systems converging in early childhood, federal, regional, local, in the vertical thought process, and then in the horizontal, health, nutrition, education, funding, social protection. Alignment across all of this is very helpful, both for efficiency of the resources, but also to align resources more effectively to serve children holistically and comprehensively. Funding should be adequate, sustainable, equity-based, and needs to think about the phasing and the scalability aspect of it. And funding needs to be based on program costs in order to implement programs effectively rather than the other way around. And costing needs to be ingredient-based to really understand what does it cost to have the program that we want to have and how do we get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Milagros. Oops. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the screen, Halima. I think we have a little time to take a few questions. So far, questions have been about the presentation and the recording. The Khalifa Award will provide the recording of the session and also access to the presentations. There is, I think there is a way to confirm your attendance, but perhaps you can address that question, Halima.
Everyone attend the webinar will be having a certificate by the end of the webinar. We have all the data and the email that they are registered in.
Terrific. So you don't have to do anything. It will come to you. Questions for the presenters? Would someone like to take the question on the intersection between early years education and brain health?
I mean, I could give it a stab. I mean, we know that early years are critical for child development, brain development being what guides that aspect as well. But there's also physical development related to and subsequent to brain development. So I think here, this is why we asked I think there's an alignment in the presentations and thinking about how we do it and how we do it well. Because just putting children in in a space together for the full day doesn't serve the aspects that have to do with brain development, that have to do with stimulation of children and language development and cognitive development, executive functions, and all the aspects that are related to children's development, and also that are predictive of later trajectory for children.
Even if I can also say something about that. I think, that's why for programming, and when I spoke about scale and systemic change, we also need to ensure that we're working within frameworks of early learning. So it's not something is better than nothing, but rather a quality early education, because obviously the intersection is certainly there between education and brain health, and also for us to thus have programming that is age-appropriate programming, using toys and resources that are always age-appropriate, because we obviously want children to learn within a scaffolding approach as well.
May I take another question that's been
Please.
typed? Yeah. It's about what strategies can be implemented. Well, like governments always know what is the cheapest way to improve the quality of education. So actually, one of the cheapest ways is investing in the workforce, investing in training, what we call in-service training, pre-service training. That seems to be one of the best ways to improve the quality of education, because a trained teacher will benefit many years if she stays in the workforce, will many will influence positively many generations of students. Another question related to the main pedagogy in the early years, I would say it's play-based learning. In most countries, all curriculum frameworks tend to privilege learning through play in some ways, a mixed approach. We acknowledge that all children learn differently, and we tend to have a balance between play and didactic approaches. And this is called use different terms: play-based learning, guided participation, scaffolding. So that seems to be the most common pedagogy in the early years.
There is also a question about specific curriculum models. I'll have to say my own view, having studied this for many decades, is that we probably need to focus more on doing whatever model we do well, and to go back to Nirmala's comments, to investing in the teachers and providing them the supports they need to do that well, than to think that there'll be a specific model, one brand, as it were, that's going to be completely superior to all the others. They have different advantages and disadvantages. I prefer some over others, but in the reality of how programs get implemented, there's more variation within models than there is between models. And so that, to me, suggests that our first thing needs to be doing whatever it is we do well with high quality for children. And then we can figure out if we might be better off doing something else well. But if you don't do it well, it doesn't matter which one you do.
I think I just want to add to what you have said, Stephen. I think that apart from that, in Africa and what we found in some regions that we work with in the Middle East is that there are childminders that are already existent. So they're already looking after children. And what we've actually established in these countries is actually to train these childminders on an effective programming. And like you say, I think that there's many curriculums out there, but all of it has to be play-based curriculums. So to train these individuals to also make sure that how they are looking after children actually includes a educational system as well, which I think is what we found is one of the fastest ways to rapidly scale a program.
I think I would just add that everybody did mention is that data and understanding where children are and where we want to get them is central to informing our work with teachers and informing our work around curriculum and informing. So without and just implementing a program without knowing how we're doing is, I mean, it's central. It's just similar to we get a health checkup and then we figure out if we have something to change in our lifestyles. Is the same idea with children and children's development, and the work teachers do with children is like if we have data, then we can help the system continuously improve, because it's very naive to think we're going to do it well from day one, or that we're doing well. We usually have to improve everything we do. So this is the same idea, and data feeds into that process very well and into supporting teachers and children.
Mm-hmm. Could I also just add, and with that data, I think that the one thing that we've looked at as well is mentorship and coaching, because I think that using the data, then effective mentors or coaches to teachers or to childminders as such, or ECD practitioners, really helps the system to grow, because then you can be very agile and you can go into the ECD center and say, look, we're partnering with you, we're mentoring you on informing your practice or your play-based practice. And that has been a very effective way to obviously scaffold the process and to make sure that it gets better and better. So even if you're starting from a very small or low base, you can eventually get to a higher base through the mentoring and coaching, but most importantly, using the information or the data that you receive to actually properly affect the system as well.
I think you can see there are a number of questions about preparation of the workforce, the quality of the workforce, and many of these center, to go back to Milagros' presentation, really, I think, around costs. It's expensive to have a high quality early childhood caregivers, teachers, both in terms of their initial preparation and their professional development. I think what we have to keep in mind is that the returns are contingent on adequate investment. And I don't know that there's a shortcut, but I'd be happy to hear other people weigh in on this.
Quality is expensive. There is no shortcut, but the cheap way to get quality is to invest in teachers and developing a curriculum. But you have to have standards, the minimum structural quality standards about safe spaces, minimum. You need some equipment, you need some books, you need,
Yes. So go ahead, Candace.
So just to also say, I think, yes, quality is expensive in terms of education. So the education piece or quality education, what we found quite interesting or quite cost effective is duplicating the same strategy wherever we go. So, for example, in all of our partner countries, it is the same strategy. So almost you have the secret five, or it's not a secret, but 5 basic simple strategies that work wherever you go, and you always use that. without deviating from that. So almost like a business, how you would not deviate from your core, and then having add-ons with introducing partners into your system. So it's quite interesting because we found that from a cost-effective principle, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel wherever we go. We're actually using the same model. But that has obviously been from education, and then of recent, actually also using AI or technology. So, for example, we realized that there were about 40 items or toys that could be used in ECD programming that could affect quality. So we actually looked at 3D printing. So for example, not taking new toys or trying to find suppliers in different countries, but rather saying, could we use a 3D printer to actually have toys that could be introduced into a system, which has been quite beneficial because obviously you're using a blueprint that is the same everywhere you go. It does come with its challenges. Obviously, if you're working with different governments, with different countries, there's always these curriculums that exist. So it's also then about being a little bit agile to see how you can best work within government frameworks as well.
Thank you. And as we're nearing the time we need to close, I want to make one final statement that I encourage those in the audience who are interested to go to the Khalifa International Award in Early Learning website. If you're interested in applying for the award, there are very detailed explanations of the process. There's a list of FAQs to assist you, and really everything you need is on that website. And it's very well designed. Just to make sure you get to the right website on the Early Learning Award, and I think you'll find everything available to you. So thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody joining us today, and I want to thank our panelists for their excellent presentations.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation today. Hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night. Sorry, it's good night for me. Good day for the rest of you.